anybody want to share their process with us?
Well, as a scientist, I just looked at the numbers and kind of looked for something to stand out. And I noticed that the highest number of students who completed the survey were in grades 7 and 8, but they had the lowest, second lowest average of percent correct on quizzes taken. So obviously the amount of books. So I thought maybe there was a change around grade 6 that affected their reading scores. So I thought maybe they went to high school or there was middle school or something that changed the dynamic of and the importance of maybe reading.
So you're getting into the why, the analysis, right? So there's this finding that there's this decline, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, well, what happened? Why the decline? Maybe it's because they're shifting schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, and shifting priorities a little bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, presumably if this were your field, you'd have done some research additionally, and you might actually be able to corroborate that with other studies. And there have been other studies, actually, quite a few of them, about how that transition, right, from primary school to middle school, or sorry, secondary school, and where teenagers start to change their priorities. They start to focus more on their social lives, and they start to play more with video games, and like all these things that take away from reading. So if you had that background, you could then back up that hypothesis, really. But the important part today is that you've come to a why. So what next? Did you get to the so what and the what next?
I thought maybe about, I mean, you said other researchers existed, but maybe focusing on a study on that and maybe asking more questions. Because this is vague, but it covers a lot of age groups, but maybe focusing on maybe grades 7 and 8 to see if it is something to do with high school, and maybe being able to create a quiz on putting their priorities and seeing where things rate on the scale. On it, maybe reading rates really low, then I could conclude something.
So your what next would be about digging in a little deeper with this very particular group as to what else might be going on that's drawing their attention away from reading. Yeah, that's good. That's good. What about the so what? Do you think there are any implications for what you see in that table? Does it matter? Do we care?
Well, we should care as society in improving the literacy enjoyment of youth, but also looking at some of the books, they're not very, you know, I think of Wuthering Heights and, you know, things like that they've kind of lost their, I don't know, appeal. Or but maybe these are what kids want to read, so if they're reading, they're reading.
Well, that's a really important question. And there you've actually expressed two not conflicting, but two different viewpoints in this field. And this is where, if this were what you were researching, you need to deal with both. Well, what's more important here? Am I more more focused on the implications for education? Or am I more interested in focusing on enjoyment and other reasons for reading, right? And those would be two things that, you know, they might sort of seem like, well, I don't know if it's that big a deal, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, it's very important. Those would be two different paradigms that you would need to point out in your discussion of this potential problem, right?
And all the book levels look like below a 5.
Yeah.
Is that like grade 5 reading? Like there are these,
It actually is, yes.
so none of these books are above the level that they should be.
Yeah, it's a shocker, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, reporters got their hands on this and just went crazy, in fact, last year. Like, oh my God, what are our kids reading?
Yeah.
And this is where you get like these alarmist reports, right? About how teenagers are all illiterate now, we're failing.
Yeah.
But, you know, as I said before, getting to this so what next? Well, there might be other factors at play here. We need to ask those questions, right? So you're digging. This is discussion. That is discussion. Good work.
Okay. Should I maybe change my topic?
Yeah, you can take this up if you like. Although our partner is. So. Who else would like to take a stab at it? Did you guys have any interesting findings that jumped out at you?
Possibly the difficulty level, or the average difficulty level in year 12 seemed to drop significantly.
Sorry.
Seemed to drop significantly to probably the same level as maybe an 8 or 9 year old.
Yeah.
When they're 16 or 17.
Yeah. So 16 or 17-year-olds are reading at a 9-year-old level.
Yeah.
That is the finding. Yeah, it's kind of a shocker, isn't it? Yeah. So what did you do with that? What might be your analysis of why that might be the case?
possibly as a distraction from going into a higher level of study. They're in fifth year at that point, so they're doing their hires, or what we call them nowadays.
That's excellent, actually. And there's quite a lot of research to corroborate that too. Teenagers being interviewed saying things like, well, I read for escapism, and things are hard right now. Like, I don't want to read Wuthering Heights. I want to escape from my studies. So that would be a really excellent thread to follow, right? If you had that context, you could then work that into your analysis, yeah? What about the so what? Are there implications for this, do you think?
It would probably depend on what other studies they're doing. If it was affecting the studies, then yes, but if not, then so what?
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, the so what might be so what. Maybe we're making too big a deal out of this. Maybe it's not that bad if there's no actual decline in literacy.
Yeah, because when you go up to year 13, it jumps quite significantly again.
Yeah.
So it's maybe just been that because of all the extra study they're doing, they need to escape for that period of time until the brain gets used to a higher level.
Yeah.
And it's probably a better means of them reading below their reading level than it is watching TV that is below their level. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely don't want them watching CVVs or something
Yeah.
like that instead of
Why
reading.
not?
That's a pretty real escapism. But so, I mean, what about the what next then? If this is what you're getting at, isn't it? That maybe
Yeah.
we need to go into other studies or ask more questions about this. Where might you go with it?
I'm not sure.
No?
Kind of trying to find a solution to the problem, I guess, and I don't know, maybe schools should do something about recommending higher reading, or
Yeah, that's good. That's really good.
we talked a bit about peer pressure as well,
Yeah.
just like, you know, kids sort of,
Kids don't talk about books anymore. They don't talk about what
yeah,
they read.
that,
Well, they do a
or,
little
you
bit,
know,
actually.
why are you
That's
reading that
good.
book, that's boring, you know,
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
Well, that's so old or something.
They talk about books actually, but usually like series novels, and often if they've been turned into movies, but sometimes not, right?
Mhm.
And actually the social motivation for reading is actually quite a bit more than one would think. Yeah, who knew, right?
Or maybe even more, they could look at maybe in this survey including what textbooks they're reading. Like maybe there's a lot more textbooks
Mhm.
kind of being read, and that would increase the level of
Yeah.
literacy.
A lot of the things you guys are saying come down to potential shortcomings in the methodology. You know, maybe not all the right questions are being asked in this study. Maybe this study should also be asking, a complete study should also be asking what their motivation is for choosing the books they choose, what their purpose is for reading in general, what other stuff they're reading, how does this relate to their studies, right? There's missing things going on. Can you imagine how it might relate to your own dissertation? Have we got any little kernels of thought happening anywhere?
I think it's really easy to overcomplicate your own research. So trying to think of anything on it is very overwhelming, especially when you just kind of bombarded yourself with information.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a fresh pair of eyes looking at you. It's kind of a good way, whether that's someone else or friend or
Yeah, actually, a little bit of advice from an outsider can really help focus you, actually. You can really miss the key points sometimes when you're bogged down in it. That whole can't see the forest for the trees thing, right? This is also something that we were talking about, right? We get sort of overwhelmed trying to overcomplicate things. You know, you go looking for the answers. What is the answer? What happened in my study? How am I going to change the world and my field and everybody who ever reads this? You know, and you start looking at all these charts, and you start looking for correlations, and you start looking for these grandiose explanations, when actually the best place to start is with the most simple, potentially most obvious, right? What are the main findings of my study, right? Just looking at those charts, you know, where would I start? I would start with, okay, well, the number of quizzes taken, i.e. books read, drops off. after year 6. It's obvious. That doesn't mean I shouldn't talk about it. You know, and then I might talk about the number of quizzes passed, or I might talk about the titles they're choosing. I'll take all of these single basic findings and I'll pull them apart and I'll ask why and I'll ask so what and I'll go what next. And once you've done that with a few of your findings, you'll start to see the relationships between them. You'll start to see the trends, but until you go through that process of looking at each one individually, you won't see the larger story. So start simple. Yeah? Where to start? With what you have in front of you. Start with the most obvious things and go from there. Take them individually. Do you guys have any questions about this process at the moment? You might adapt it. You probably will adapt it to your own practice. Everybody writes and thinks differently, right? But I would urge you to keep these questions no matter how you approach them. Why? So what? And what next? When I'm writing, I always keep a sticky note like stuck to my screen that says, so what? So that everything I write down, I think to myself, so what? Why am I writing this? Why is this important? What does it mean? How is it significant? Does anybody care? Because if they don't, I probably shouldn't be writing it. Yeah? So let's talk about structure. So we've pulled out all these findings, we've started to think about what they mean. Now we need to put this together into a complete work, right? We need to write the thing. So I just want to go through what the basic structure of a discussion should be. I just want to make sure I'm not running out of time. Oh, brilliant, that's time. Okay, so as with anything, you want to start with an introduction, yeah? A short opening paragraph at the beginning of your discussion that will tell your reader what's going to happen in your discussion. I realize that sounds very obvious, but honestly, most people forget to do that. And any reader will be overjoyed every time you write a paragraph that says, this is what I'm going to do now. They'll be like, oh, thank God, because I've read 300 dissertations and I'm totally confused. And any signpost you can give your reader will be welcome. So start with that short opening paragraph, and that short opening paragraph should state the main findings of your study. And this is something that we were talking about over here with you guys, but you probably all felt it when you looked at that chart, right? There's an awful lot of stuff going on. There's an awful lot of data. You're going to come up with a lot of research. You're going to come up with a lot of data. You're not going to be able to talk about all of it. So part of your job is to draw out what you think is the most important, what you think is the most significant, or what will have the most impact. And those will be your main findings, and you can just leave the other findings to the side. Maybe you'll use them for another study, maybe you'll never look at them again, but don't try to talk about everything. This is critical thinking as well, right? Being discerning about what you want to discuss. So start that out with something very straightforward. Spell it out. The main findings of the current study were that, da 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 da. Yeah? And then you can go from there. As we talked about with the difference between descriptive and critical writing, you don't just want to reiterate your results. You've already done that. You've already shown your results, right? What you need to do now is explain your results. So all of these things that you've done to get yourself going, asking yourself why, so what next, this is what you need to write, the explanation for what's happened. You need to offer explanations in relation to underlying theories. So we've talked about this as something that you kind of already know about, right? You need to go back to your framework or your theory, right? So you've found some findings, you've tried to draw out the implications of them, discuss how they might be explained by the theories that you're using to back up your dissertation. Discuss how they relate to other literature. You know, you might say, my main finding was that teenagers read more than anybody else. I just made that up because it's not true. Which actually contradicts every other major study. Then I get to talk about, well, why? Why did my findings come out differently from everybody else's, right? You want to interpret your results and what they mean, right? So this is coming back again to this so what question. What do they mean? What are the implications? And then make some recommendations. What next? So really, probably the easiest way to do this, and now everybody will have their sort of own thing that they come out with in the end, but I would suggest the best thing to do to start with, when you're writing your discussion, start with that opening paragraph, and then write up one finding at a time. Start with the most significant and go from there. Work your way down. When you're revising and rewriting, and this might be one of my number one tips, leave yourself lots of time to rewrite and revise, because you'll need to. You know, after you've written out every finding individually, you might start to see that some of them come together into the same conversation, right? They might be so closely related, you might be able to connect them into one finding. And talk about them holistically that way, synthesizing, right? But you might need to write them out sort of one at a time to see that. So that's where I suggest you start. Any basic structure should have one idea at a time, right? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
So if you're doing one idea at a time,
yeah,
and then you find afterwards that they all link together,
yeah,
should you bring all the ideas at the...
Well, you still need to break it down.
Link.
Yeah, so then you want to think about how they relate, right? And this is where the academic phrase bank becomes very handy. Do you have findings that are identical? Well then yes, bring them together. Are they related? Maybe not. If they're all related, you might want to then think more precisely about the relationship. So you might talk about one finding and draw out the implications of that, and then move to the next one and say, similarly, these results show, you know, whatever it is that they show, this is part of the same trend. Right?
Maybe it would come in the recommendation or something, or
yeah,
conclusion.
You might find too, and this, you know, is probably an offshoot of your question, that your recommendations for what next, what do I do with this, might keep being the same over and over again. Leave that bit to the end and take it all out and dump it at the end. It probably should be at the end anyway. But when you're first writing it out, it really helps to write out each one by one. When you get to the end, after you've made your recommendations, you want to then highlight any limitations of your study. So if you know that you've done like quantitative research that's going to show you all kinds of numbers about, you know, literacy levels or whatever, but not draw out sort of the reasons behind why kids are choosing the books they're reading, like we've been talking about, that would be the moment at which you say, you know, a qualitative study might unearth different explanations for this and would be very interesting to take forward. Because I've only done this quantitative study, this is the only data that I can look at. And that doesn't mean it's not worth looking at. That doesn't mean it's not good work. It just means it's not complete, and it shouldn't be complete. No dissertation, no study, no academic work answers all the questions. So you need to acknowledge that and become self-reflexive about that. And you can do it in a way that's not negative, you know, that's not focused on, well, this is what I did wrong and none of it worked out. You know, don't go that route. Just, you know, be open about what you could have done differently if you wanted to look at different things. But don't start there. Don't start by saying, I could have done a lot of different things and it would have been different, but instead I did this, because it starts at a weak moment, right? Leave that to the end. And then again, come back around to the implications. You always want to remind your reader that what you've done is important, it's significant, it has a value. And it does have a value, even if you're sick of it at the end and you think, oh my God, I hate this nonsense, this is total garbage, you'll feel that way. But try not to lose sight of the fact that the work you've done is important. You started doing it because it was important and it interested you, so you want to remind your reader of that as well, right at the end. And then come back to a summary, a real basic summary of what those main findings were. Just to remind your reader what you've done, yeah? And that's where you get to branch into your conclusion from there. Do you guys have any questions? I hope this is helping a little bit clarify the process and what a discussion should do. If we bring all this together, which we will because we're just about out of time, A discussion should express your ideas and arguments clearly. This is what your readers are looking for, that your ideas and arguments are clear. And again, coming back to writing it one piece at a time can help you to gain the clarity that you need to present it clearly, yeah? You need to use relevant sources and evidence, so make sure you're always backing up everything that you say, yeah?
Yeah, could you suggest us how many words do you think the discussion should?
Well, this is a difficult question because every department will have a different template and different recommendations. Your discussion should be longer than your findings. In fact, your discussion should probably be the longest section of your dissertation. Potentially the second. Your literature review might be really substantial as well. But if you're unsure about whether or not you've written enough, you need to go back to your module handbook and maybe sit down with your supervisor and talk about like what the spread should look like. But in your handbook, there's a good chance you'll have a breakdown of where all the marks come from, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a look at that breakdown and see like where does discussion come into it, it might not say like discussion 30%. It might say demonstrates critical and analytical thinking 30%. And then you know that the discussion is that part where you get to show that off the most. So you want to weight that quite heavily. It should be the most substantial section of your dissertation, but for word counts, you should definitely talk to your supervisor.
And it does seem different in different departments, or because on our handbook, I said we didn't really have anything called discussion in our section, so it's got, for example, just an example of word count. It says literature review between 3,000 and 5,000, methodology between 2 and 2,500, and then it's just got findings 3,500.
All right.
And you think, well, does that include the analysis? It must do. But it doesn't. It doesn't have anything separate. It doesn't have findings and discussion. It just has findings.
Yeah.
And then you've got conclusions and recommendations. So.
Yeah, it seems like findings and discussion have now been lumped together in that model, but you might want to check that they're not looking for the discussion in the conclusion.
I mean, it does say conclusions, the number of words depends on how much analysis is in the findings.
Aha, okay, so your analysis is in your findings
It must
section.
be, yeah.
And you will
But
find that each is different,
Yeah.
and they group these sections differently, but the essence of what you're doing as you're moving from the beginning to the end of the dissertation is the same.
Because it sounded, from what you were saying, it was like the findings is a list of all the facts, and then you've got a separate section.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I'll have to ask my supervisor.
Yeah, you want to see, they might want you to present it the same way, but all in the same chapter. So you might have findings, you might present all the findings and then discuss them with subheadings.
Yeah.
Or they might want to see something more integrated where you present a finding and then discuss it, and then present another finding and discuss it.
Yeah. So I need to find out actually how they want it.
Yeah.
Because it's clearer just to know that you've got the findings, facts, and then you've got the discussion.
Yeah.
They haven't asked us for that.
Everyone is a bit different.
Yeah.
I did English, so we didn't do that at all.
Okay.
And it was a total mystery. I was like, how do I write a dissertation? And nobody could
Did you not
tell
get any
me.
breakdown?
No, not at all. You just have to figure it out.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a totally different way of analyzing stuff. So it was,
Yeah.
I
it
wish
depends
it
on the
could have
subject.
been broken down for me in that way. But then I came to the end of it and I realized that wouldn't have worked. So I get it now, but I didn't get it at the beginning.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it make sense if I just said, because I was doing this last night, I was tearing my hair out. I had 2 or 3 dissertations from previous students in our faculty. And I was kind of looking at, I was sitting, counting how many words they had done for each bit. And I had about 3 of them, so I was trying to get an average between them. But I mean, one of them had done like 5,500 words for the literature review, and one had only done 2,700.
Can vary.
So
Well,
I
we
was
said
looking
for us
back-
3,000 to 5,000 for the literature review, so just depends what you've got to write, I suppose.
I was looking
And
at the
that's it,
breakdown,
isn't it?
and would you say, I've got there what they're saying, introduction 5%, literature review 20, analysis and interpretation 20, etc. Does it make sense to say, right, if I'm going to aim for 16,000 words.
Mhm.
Could I then break that down, right? So 20% of 16,000 words is X amount of words, and then that gives me do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to do it that way, go right ahead. I think that's a good strategy. It would certainly be helpful in structuring it in your own mind. I think, yeah. What it comes down to is that there's really no definitive answer to this, right? Like every piece of research is going to look a little bit different in the end. How much you weight your discussion versus your literature review, for instance, or how long your findings are, or whatever, depends so much on what exactly you have to say. But everybody will develop a practice that works for them. And it sounds like that might be a good place to start for you, breaking it down in those weightings so that you can conceptualize it for yourself. You might go off them a little bit at the end, and that would probably be fine, right? But it might be a good place to start.
I think it's just so you have an idea, roughly, right? That's otherwise I'd be away doing like 8,000 words on the literature review. And then
Yeah. Well, you don't want like a 50-page introduction and then realize, oh, damn it, I put everything in my introduction, now what?
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to lose sight. So whatever you need to do to keep yourself on task, yeah, whatever you need to do to keep yourself on plan, really. And keeping an eye on those criteria is key, right? It'll remind you what the most important bits are. And the most important bits are always the critical analysis and the quality of the research. So keep an eye to those things, right? We've got to wrap up here, but I put together some top tips for you. You can have a look at the summary slides that I skipped when I send around the slides, but it's really just what we've been talking about here today. Follow your guidelines for formatting, etc. as you go. It can be incredibly time-consuming to reformat everything once you've finished. It's really nice if you've already got it in place before you start, so that you don't waste too much time on that. Plan the structure of your discussion. So write yourself a little outline, even if it's just a sketch outline, even if it's just a bullet points, like I'm going to talk about this, 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 and this, in this order, okay? And that will help you to stay on task if you've got that plan. Be selective about what you choose to write about, because you can't say it all, right? If you're struggling with the writing, write the bits you're most comfortable with first, and then drop them in as you finish them. Don't worry about going from start to finish. That can help with stress a lot too, you know, when you're sitting and looking at that empty page and going, I don't know what to say. But you do know what to say about a couple things. So if you write those couple things down, then you don't have a blank page anymore and you're good to go, yeah? If you can, go over a draft with your supervisor if they'll let you, because they can tell you if you're missing anything important or if there's something they'd like to see more of. Ultimately, they know what it is that they're looking for, am I right? And give yourself plenty of time to rewrite and revise, because chances are it will look very different in the end than it did in the beginning, and it should. Part of how we discover what it is that we want to say is just by writing it out. And then you write it down and then you see it and you're like, oh, that's what I was going to say. Oh, right, it makes sense now. I never know. Like, I mean, I always think I know where I'm going. And then I end up at the end of a piece of work and I'm like, oh, wow, that's not what I thought it was about. Good to know. And then I have to go back and revise. So keep that in mind when you're planning your time.
How long should you, roughly? I know everybody's different, but
I would give yourself a few weeks at least, if you can.
To write it up, you mean?
No, to revise.
To revise.
To revise. Yeah, actually, you know, there's
only got 4 weeks.
Yeah, get as much down on paper as you can, because you will need, give yourself as much time as you can to revise.
Do different courses have different dates to hand it in? Because mine is
18th.
the 12th of August.
18th.
Yeah, they are a bit different.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
But they're all roughly around the same time, yeah. Give yourself as much time as you can.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that, you know, you don't have to write it perfectly. The first draft always takes us the longest, but actually in good writing practice, the first draft should be the quickest thing you do, because it should be total garbage. And then you can start, I mean, the rewriting is actually the writing, So just get everything that you can down on paper, and even if it doesn't look finished to you, I mean, that is a draft. So rewriting is, you know, it's more of the process than you probably think.
Can I just ask as well, so the research that we do is the primary data, yeah, so all the information from there, but do people use a lot of, if they don't have, you know, I've done 6 interviews and I've got a lot of information from that, but am I right in thinking that you can use other sources as well? So the secondary data is important as well.
Yeah, the secondary data is important.
They're
as
not
well.
just expecting you to have things from your organisation, you can use information from other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we come back to our little practice activity, we kind of skipped over that bit, but before you start digging into these questions about why, so what next, you also need to relate that finding to previous work. This is where you bring in secondary literature. I didn't do that so much with you guys today because we don't all have the same research to work with.
Because I just think that might turn back into like the literature review again.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the literature review is from information from secondary data. So I'm just a bit confused about how I pull the secondary data into the analysis as well.
This is, it's a writing strategy
Mm.
is what it comes down to. So as you're dealing with each finding, in order to keep the focus on your research instead of shifting the focus to other people's research, you need to foreground your own with, you know, language like, my research found this.
So this is the primary data?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that might be how you start that paragraph. My study found this.
Mhm.
This has been corroborated in other studies by this, and this. It's related to this other study and this, and that. And then you can start drawing out the why, the so what, the what next. But if you start out by saying, I found,
Sure.
you keep the focus on you. Every paragraph, if you look at the first sentence of a paragraph, it should say something about what that paragraph is going to be about. So you might want to, as you're going through your discussion, look at the beginning of each paragraph and just double check. Am I still focused on me here? Or have I lost track and gone off to my outside research?